Sanctuary online and in person. What's up? First of all, happy Pride Month. Woo-hoo. Yeah. I'm Minister Charlie, they, them pronoun user, the Minister of Education at Sanctuary. Everything good? Yeah. Awesome. So today I will be doing a little mini series. We're starting a mini series on adoption in Bible times. But first, I have a question for the group. Who here is familiar with the adoption process? Yeah, and I specifically am passing the mic to you so you can talk about it.
Yes. So what would you like to know, friend?
Just like the basics of the process.
Um,
Like,
Yeah, hold the mic closer.
like I would say, what does it? You go through? Does it go through the government? Does it go through like a private agency?
okay, so there's several ways to answer that question, and yes to all of them, actually.
Okay.
Because in certain circumstances, you can go through foster care,
Mm-hmm.
which is usually done through the government, through the Department of Social Services,
Mm-hmm.
through a government agency. But there's also private agencies, and then there's orphanages that are private that you can go through as well,
Okay.
and like adoption to family, outside of family. That there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of avenues you can go with it.
And
So
I guess. Oh, continue your thought. You're good.
individual situations are going to differ significantly.
Okay. And then the last question I've got for you is, do people primarily adopt for like inheritance purposes, or what are some of the, I guess, most common reasons why people
Well, I
adopt?
was going to say that can play a factor as well
Okay.
for like orphan children. You remember the book series on the Baudelaire orphans? That's very much a real thing, by the way.
Gotcha.
That
Yep.
does happen.
Series of unfortunate events. Got it.
Yes. So
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. So I need to turn back this thing on. So we just had Brad share a little bit about the adoption process, but I just wanted to ask, so to give us kind of an understanding of what adoption is like in, at least here in the US and in your experience, because we don't live, in Bible times, obviously. The adoption process today is a lot different than it was back then. But that's exactly why we're going to study it, because when we read scripture and we read about people being adopted, or later I'm going to talk about Paul's letters where he mentions like we are adopted as sons into God's family. We need to know about the adoption process that they were familiar with so we can better understand who God is and what God did for us. So, background, the topic is related to Minister Nick's sermon, which I'm not going to spoil. But again, regardless, adoption is mentioned in Paul's letters to different churches. We'll talk about those letters in a future Sunday school lesson. Like I said, this is a mini series. So, Lord willing, in I think 2 months from now, we'll really be able to dive deep into the scripture references. But today, we're just learning about the basics. Yes, but for now, all you need to know is that Paul used the concept of adoption as his audience understood it to describe what Christ did for humanity. So, overview of today's lessons. We are, like I said, we're only going to cover the basics, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. I've broken down the lesson into 6 questions, and the questions are: who could adopt and who could be adopted? What went into the adoption process back then? And thank you again, Brad, for sharing your experience about that. When did adoption become a common practice? Where is adoption mentioned in the Bible? Why do we need to know about adoption in ancient times? I've already kind of explained it, but we'll go a little bit more in depth. And then how does the ancient practice of adoption apply to us today? But before I dive in, I want to give some disclaimers. So, disclaimers are really important when we're talking about the past, because what experts know is always changing. So, with that said, the information in the Sunday school lesson is both accurate but incomplete. So, the sources I used are recent and reveal what experts today know and think they know about the. Sorry, I'm lost my place. About the past. However, the information is incomplete. Excuse me, because experts are always discovering new evidence that challenges what they knew about the past. So we also need to remember that the part of the world that we're studying is going through a lot of changes, and it has gone through a lot of changes since Bible times. So civilizations have risen and fallen. Natural disasters have literally reshaped the land, and wars, like modern wars, have made it difficult for experts to study what the past was like. However, just because experts haven't found evidence of a person, place, or thing does not necessarily mean that the person, place, or thing didn't exist. So with all of that out of the way, let's dive into it. So we're starting with question 1. Who could adopt and who could be adopted? And if you'll allow me to rotate this a little bit so I can see. No, I can't. That's fine. So back in Bible times, men were basically the only ones who had any agency. If you remember from the mini-series on biblical marriage, women were considered property instead of people. That's, moral issues of that aside, that's just how it was back then. And so we have to keep that in mind when approaching scripture. So men and boys were typically the only ones involved in the adoption process. Yeah, but not just any male. They had to be, or for the most part, they were citizens of the Greek or Roman empires. That's because the adoption process came with a lot of legal responsibilities. If you want to learn more about the legal stuff, and there is a lot of legal stuff, there is an article called Adoption in Ancient Rome on Wikipedia that is very thorough. So I highly recommend reading that. So now on question 2, what went into the adoption process back then? So we've already heard from Brad about what the adoption process, it's got a lot of moving parts here in the US today. From my research, there were not as many nuances, but just because I couldn't find any nuances doesn't mean they didn't exist. So in general, the person being adopted would no longer be part of his biological family. Instead, he would become part of the household who adopted him, of the man who adopted him. So in ancient Greece, the adopted son would take on the legal obligations and religious duties of his father. In ancient Rome, the adopted son would submit himself to the power and control of his adopted father. This is a term that in Latin is called paterfamilias. I learned about it in my Latin class. I didn't really understand it back then, but that is what we are going to be talking about in next Sunday school lesson, because it is just a huge topic to cover. Basically, it's the idea that a father in the Roman Empire had ultimate control over his family, so much so that it had several words for it. And so we're going to dive into that, Lord willing, next month's Sunday school lesson, so that we can better understand Paul's letters once we start to study them next. Yes, so it deserves its own lesson because there's just a lot.
So
patriarchy to the extreme. It's nuts. But again, Wikipedia has some great resources if you want to go ahead and start to look those up. But now question 3, when did adoption become a common practice? This is the part that really interested me, because adoption was really a formal process only in the Greek and Roman empires. And so let me see. It wasn't a thing among the Israelites. And I know what some of y'all are thinking, because what about Moses and Pharaoh's daughter, or Esther and her uncle Mordecai? So it's a kind of sort of not really adoption situation. And let me explain. Let's start with Moses. Most translations of Exodus 2:10 on Bible Gateway say that Pharaoh's daughter, quote, took him and he became her son. The same is true with Esther. In most translations of Esther 2:15 on Bible Gateway, it says her uncle had, quote, taken her for his daughter. There's actually no Hebrew word that means the same thing as the biblical Greek word for adoption, which is the word. Yeah, it's the word that Paul mostly used. So there's no direct translation. It's a lot of, yeah. What's up?
That's a crossover then, because he was also a Roman citizen.
Yes, Paul was a Roman citizen.
So the adoption thing, that wasn't a Jewish idea.
No, it wasn't Jewish.
From Greek and Roman culture, so that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and I went ahead and because I haven't refreshed myself with the letters we're going to be talking about later. Well, no, I hadn't up to that point. I read the passages that I mentioned later, which are going to be y'all's homework. I'm still getting ahead of myself, excuse me, but because, like you said, Paul was a Roman citizen, and most of his audience was in the Roman Empire, so they would have been familiar with this custom.
In the Greek culture.
And the Greek culture, yeah. So that's why he used this process. And so understanding it for ourselves helps us understand how we relate to God. Did I already talk about? Oh no, I'm only halfway through that question. So, yes, instead of having a formal adoption process like the Greeks and Romans did, the Israelites had rules about tribal possessions with details that deal with issues of inheritance. So, I don't know if y'all recall in the miniseries on biblical marriage when I talked about like the concubinage and the levirate marriage and stuff, like inheritance was a big deal back then because they needed male heirs to be able to carry on the family name, carry on property, like all this stuff. So when a childless man among the Israelites didn't have anybody to like pass his possessions on to, there was a command in Numbers 27, 8 through 11, that said any stuff that he had would basically go to his nearest male relative. And so that's pretty much the custom that they use to provide for, like, you know, people's legacies and stuff. But there wasn't really a formal adoption process because everybody lived in like little communities. But now you flash forward a few centuries to the time of the Greek and Roman empires, and instead of living in like small tribal communities where, yeah, they could have gotten by with, they didn't necessarily need to have formal rules because everybody agreed on stuff, then people lived in like massive cities, and larger cities needed more laws and stricter laws to maintain order. So that's where inheritance rights come in. And I, if you can stand all the legal jargon, I would recommend reading inheritance laws in ancient Rome because it talks about wills, it talks about heirs. You and I are familiar with this from writing for attorneys, but if somebody dies intestate, which basically means without a will, there's provisions for that. And so it's very similar to the process that we have in the US when it comes to settling a person's affairs. But yeah, I'm not going to get into all of that detail, so it's just a lot. But yeah, primarily adoption is being done for inheritance back in the day. So where is adoption mentioned in the Bible? Paul is the only writer in the Protestant Bible, so the 66-book Bible that a lot of us have. Paul's the only one who talked about adoption. So he used the concept as an analogy to help new converts to Christianity understand their role in God's family. Like I said, we'll discuss specific passages in a future Sunday school lesson, but in the meantime, I would recommend looking at Romans 8, Galatians 4, and Ephesians 1 for all of that context. And I've already touched on this before. Why do we need to know about this topic? And in general, understanding what life was like in Bible times helps us understand Scripture better. And when we understand Scripture better, we can understand God better, especially who God is and what He's done for us. Although we're not going to get into specific passages today because this is, again, just an overview of the basics. I actually am giving you all homework, and your homework is to read Romans 8, Galatians 4, and Ephesians 1 on your own. And you might be surprised at how much more you understand those passages now that you know a little bit more about adoption in Bible times. And now finally, for question number 6, how does this ancient practice apply to us today? So when we consider the adoption process from the Greek and Roman empires, so like not the adoption process that we're familiar with today, but the adoption process that people back then were familiar with, becoming a Christian basically means being adopted by God. Adoption gives us a loving father to cling to, an eternal family to belong to, an inheritance to look forward to, and responsibilities to carry out while we wait for what's coming. And we'll discuss this topic more in a future Sunday school lesson. And like I said, to be continued. Lord willing, we're having 2 more of these, because we covered just the basics today. Next month's lesson will hopefully be about the level of authority that fathers in the Roman Empire had, which is, the term is paterfamilias, Paterfamilias. Yep. There we go. I lost my place again. That topic would have been more familiar to Paul's audience and would have helped them understand God better. And then in the lesson after that, we'll touch on specific verses about adoption in Paul's letters. Yes, Apostle Leanne.
So I have a question.
Hold on, I'll give you the mic.
So this is just kind of something interesting that I kind of noted. You mentioned that adoption was only people who were eligible to adopt were male. That those were the
For the
only
most
people
part.
in the process. So did they adopt both male and female, or were they only exclusively adopting males?
Okay, so that's a great question. To be fair, I do not know the ins and outs of adoption in Roman times. There is a book called, I think, Adoption in the Roman Empire. I cannot remember the author's name at this point, but it is apparently really in depth. And so I say if you're really interested in that process and interested in the nuances specifically, to look that up. I was not able to find a whole lot of touching on about the nuances online, and then I actually have one of the books I used as a source, which I'll mention in the next slide. But yeah, I mean, just because we're going over the basics of, because males were typically the only ones adopted and doing the adopting, doesn't necessarily mean there weren't exceptions. So does that answer your question? Awesome.
It's just an interesting observation.
Yes, very interesting observation. So yeah, that's it. If you're, like I said, if you're interested in additional resources, this is the book that I used to get. This has actually been pretty helpful. I haven't read all of it, but it's Manners and Customs in the Bible, an illustrated guide to daily life in Bible times, the revised edition from 2003 by Victor H. Matthews. And shout out to Apostle Leanne for finding this at a used bookstore. Whoop, whoop. That was super helpful. It's actually pretty easy to read. It doesn't have a lot of academic language like a lot of textbooks do. It's got some pictures. They're all in black and white, but I would recommend that. If you want to do online sources, I got a lot of my information from the adoption entry in the Encyclopedia of the Bible, which is available for free on BibleGateway.com. And then I also can't recommend Wikipedia highly enough. If your teachers told you that Wikipedia isn't necessarily a reliable source, that may have been true back then, but at the same time, it's more reliable than ChatGPT. It cites its sources, and I would just say that you can get an overview from some of the articles. If you want the nuances, definitely check the sources mentioned in Wikipedia articles. So that is all for today's Sunday school lesson, but be sure to stick around for our service, which is going to be Minister Nick's, and it's a One Piece themed sermon. Yeah, I see you've got Luffy's hat on right now. It looks great. So yes, One Piece fans, you will definitely want to stick around. But see y'all in a little bit.